Mr. Pennard, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, honourable members, thank you for the opportunity to appear on behalf of the Energy Futures Institute regarding the electric vehicle availability standard, better known as the federal EV mandate. I will address a number of pressing issues. 1, declining market for EVs. Statistics Canada reports a significant drop in market share for EVs. In the first quarter of this year, zero-emission vehicles, that's fully battery electrics and plug-in hybrids combined, accounted for about 9% of new vehicle sales, down from 12.5% in the first quarter of last year. In the second quarter of this year, the news got worse, with the share slipping further to 8.6%. This represents a one-quarter drop in 12 months and should be a flashing warning sign for policymakers. No battery electric passenger vehicles are currently assembled in Canada. The one EV assembly line in our country for GM's BrightDrop electric delivery van was recently shut down due to weak demand. Meanwhile, Toyota and Honda continue to assemble regular hybrid vehicles here in Ontario, such as the Honda Civic, CR-V, and the RAV4, many of which I see around the streets of Ottawa. But under both the federal and BC mandates, these vehicles don't count towards zero-emission targets and could face penalties of up to $20,000 per vehicle in BC and Quebec. While Quebec recently announced plans to award partial credit for conventional hybrids, mandates penalize vehicles that are currently built in Canada while encouraging EV imports, strengthening U.S.-based automakers such as Tesla at our expense. Does this make sense? 2, compliance credit system transfers money out of Canada. The EV availability standard allows automakers exceeding the sales targets to earn credits that can be banked or sold. Those below target must purchase credits. As mentioned under the BC and Quebec programs, they may pay large penalties, up to $20,000 per vehicle, if they don't get enough credits. In practice, this directs millions of dollars to high-volume EV producers, such as Tesla. We recommend redesigning the system so credits reward Canadian industrial investment rather than sending money out of our country. 3, electricity demand and infrastructure. Studies estimate that fully electrifying Canada's passenger fleet will increase national electricity consumption by 7.5% to 15%. That equals up to 19 more Site C dams. That's the recently completed $16 billion project in northeastern British Columbia, or up to 4 more Darlington-sized nuclear power stations, just for vehicles. Recently, hydro-based provinces have been importing power. BC Hydro's latest annual report shows they imported 8,356 gigawatt-hours, equivalent to 14.7% of total domestic load, at a cost of $861 million. While that's down from 24% of imported power last year, which cost $1.5 billion, it still means 1 in 7 electrons used in British Columbia came from imported power, mostly from the U.S., where roughly 60% of electricity continues to come from fossil fuel generation. Hydro-Quebec was also a net importer in 2023, bringing in about 7% of required supply. Manitoba Hydro has at times imported electricity in dry years. Let's not deepen our dependence on the United States for either vehicles or electricity. 4, consumer affordability and inequality. EV mandates risk deepening social inequality. An analysis by Jerome Jusseroli of the BC Institute of Technology shows that aggressive EV mandates can raise prices by 20% or more by restricting the supply of non-EV vehicles, with a ripple effect pushing up prices of used cars that lower-income households rely on. Apartment dwellers also face greater challenges and costs, and rural Canadians face longer travel distances with less public charging infrastructure. 5, recommendations. Rather than using mandates to dictate a specific technology, a proven approach is to continue using Canada's Motor Vehicle Fuel Consumption Standards Act, similar to the U.S. CAFE standards, requiring progressive improvements to average fuel economy across manufacturers' fleets. But if some form of mandate remains, then we recommend give at least partial credit to regular hybrids and consider full credit if they're assembled in Canada. We should not allow our desire for the perfect to become the enemy of the very good. Let's remove the cap on plug-in hybrids so they can count for 100% compliance, provided they have at least a certain minimum all-electric range. 75 kilometres would cover the daily commute of more than 90% of Canadians. Let's reward Canadian value chain investment, such as critical mineral processing, batteries, charging networks, and vehicle assembly, with compliance credits. And let's align any targets with infrastructure and affordability. Consider changing the target years and required percentages to reflect reality, and work with provinces to ensure the grid keeps pace with EV-related growth. In closing, vehicle electrification can support Canada's climate goals, but government policy needs to be affordable and aligned with industrial and energy reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Penner.
Thank you. And Mr. Penner, thank you for your submission. Thank you for being here. This government talks about an electric vehicle future, but refuses to talk about the infrastructure, the cost needed to basically allow that future to take place. Your submission talks about national electricity consumption by 7.5% to 15%, which would equal 19 more Site C dams. That $16 billion project in BC, and that took years, and I doubt we'll ever see another Site C dam completed in BC, not within the next 20 years. But could you talk more about where we make up the difference? Where does that electricity come from to make up that deficit in BC for electricity? And where does that electricity, where is that sourced?
Thank you for your question. As I mentioned, BC Hydro has been a net importer of electricity now for, I think we're into our third consecutive year. We've had record amounts. We've been a net importer in previous years, but overall, historically, we tended to export as well. But we've had record amounts of imports due to prolonged dry spell, below average precipitation. So when we're short, we're importing primarily from the United States, and that continues today. I checked this morning, and at 1 o'clock this morning, we're importing about 1,900 megawatts from the United States. That's to help us balance our system. So when we're short, we tend to import, not just here, but as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Manitoba and Quebec Hydro in recent years have also had to reverse the flow, the usual flow, in order to make up the difference.
And it's my understanding we also import electricity from Alberta. Is that correct?
That's correct. British Columbia has an intertie with Alberta, and about 75% of the electricity generated in Alberta today comes from natural gas.
So from what we're understanding on testimony from different witnesses, the electric vehicle mandate is possible through rebates, subsidies, but the lower income citizens of Canada can't really even afford that with rebates and whatnot. Is there a social inequality equation here that this government is not considering?
Yes, Energy Futures has issued reports on this topic. We've commissioned Jerome Gesaroli, a business instructor at the BC Institute of Technology, who's looked at this issue. And we all remember during COVID, when there was an interruption in supply chains and you couldn't get new vehicles, the price of used vehicles shot up dramatically. And who typically buys used vehicles? Lower income people. So disproportionately, his conclusion is the electric vehicle mandate will punish lower income Canadians more than higher income people that can comfortably afford to buy an EV today and have a standalone home where they can securely plug in their vehicle at night and access lower cost residential rate electricity. If you live in an apartment building like 40% of British Columbians, you're challenged to find access to charging infrastructure. And if you turn to public infrastructure, public charging stations, you're not paying the residential rate for electricity, you're paying a higher price. So it does present the challenge in accentuating social inequality rather than overcoming it.
So we've heard different comments in terms of the infrastructure cost, and it's been focused mainly on the supply, meaning dams or nuclear power or natural gas turbines, for example. And it also, we talk about transmission lines and that cost, but there's a neighborhood cost as well, neighborhood by neighborhood. And there was a cost that was related to me in terms of a transformer being installed in a neighborhood where the homeowner would probably, all the homeowners in the neighborhood would have to all chip in to pay for that cost. Has that cost been brought down to the level of each homeowner or neighborhood?
I don't know. I haven't seen any studies that have looked at that individual cost, but you raised a good point. You know, I talked about the extra amount of electricity to be required if all of Canada's personal vehicle fleet was transformed to electric mode, and that's daunting, as you mentioned, 19 Site C dams, $16 billion. And yes, that project was announced in 2010, and it's almost completed now, so 15 years later, and a lot of money spent. But that's probably the easiest part of the challenge. The much more difficult part of the challenge is building transmission lines to move that additional electricity, building the transformers in individual neighborhoods where no one wants one close to where they live, and then upgrading the distribution system into apartment buildings and older dwellings so that people can charge their vehicles overnight at the same time. that represents a much more daunting task than even building 19 more Site C dams.
So your submission talks about needing 19 more Site C dams to fully achieve the EV mandate as put forward by this government. That's a huge cost. And it's going to take a lot of time to do that. And we don't have the power, the infrastructure, or anything else to actually achieve that. But there's First Nations that want to use natural gas to produce electricity, for example. And the cost you're talking about is strictly to the EV mandate. We're not talking about additional electricity demand, such as what we're seeing in BC, that we can't even keep up with the new economy in terms of, say, building an AI plant to compete with the United States, for example. Is there some increased cost we should be looking at in terms of overall electricity demand in Canada, apart from the EV?
Right. So, yeah, future EV demand represents a very small percentage of anticipated electrical growth in Canada. If you look at British Columbia, at Energy Futures, we recently did a Freedom of Information request to BC Hydro and found out that they have 7,000 megawatts of unmet industrial demand that's waiting to be served. 7,000, that's not EVs. That's for industrial demand that we currently don't have.
Thank you, Mr. Penner. I'm sorry, time is up.
Today, been very interesting discussion. Mr. Penner, you were speaking some about grid, specifically in the BC context and generation. Importing isn't a bottomless cup, and if new generation and transmission aren't built, what's going to happen? This is a really open question right now. We'll see where it goes.
Well, we are, in British Columbia, we are working on trying to build more. We're behind the 8 ball. I heard Madam Smith's comments about importing electricity in the afternoon when it's sunny in California, I guess. But this morning, we were importing at 1 a.m., 1,900 megawatts from the United States. That's not solar power at 1 a.m. Not even in California. It's not very sunny.
Often it's not wind at night either. So what I'm getting at, so if there's no more supply available, what's going to happen to power prices?
Well, we are seeing an upward trend. In British Columbia, the BC government has ordered rates to go up 3.5% per year for the next 2 years, so a 7% increase in 2 years. That's just a down payment, because we have a big bill coming called the Site C Dam we've talked about several times today. $16 billion, which we haven't really started paying for yet.
3.5%, that seems to be higher than the level of inflation. Mr. Penner, again, sorry, we'll follow up with that. So you were saying more power generation is being built?
Yes, we're spending a lot of money, and it's borrowed money. So there's going to be interest and lots to pay in the future. But just to go back to what we're talking about here is how do we make it possible and make Canadians comfortable to purchase electric vehicles if that's what we want them to do? I think we've put the cart before the horse. The EV mandates are restricting the supply of non-electric vehicles before we have the infrastructure in place to make it convenient and affordable and reliable for Canadians to plug in their vehicles. Again, if you live at home in a standalone picket fence kind of house, that's one thing. But in an apartment building that's 50 years old, in an urban setting, it's very difficult to get your own reliable access to charging.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and I understand that. There's a huge dilemma in society, right, on how we're going to manage this. And a big part of this is underpinned by the general grid availability of how much electricity is in the grid. You alluded yourself that there's 7,000 megawatts of unserviced commercial industrial demand in BC that comes with its own opportunity costs related to how much GDP is not being produced because that opportunity is not being pursued. You know, you couple that with, incidents where Brookfield looks like it's privatizing some power generation and maybe exporting that power, just exasperates the problem. And we spoke a little bit about weather and climate and impacting low income first and worst. Well, all of these other things and everything in the economy and more debt is impacting the low income first and worst with high grocery prices. So could you please comment a little bit about what regulations and what regulatory models need to change in order to move this ball down the road a little bit, down the field a bit?
I think we need to differentiate between market signal and government directives. We've heard some talk here today about what's a market signal that government's sending. Then that's not a market signal. That's a government directive. That's quite different. The market signal right now is consumer consumption of electric vehicles is dropping in terms of market share in Canada, and that's Statistics Canada reporting that, down by a quarter in terms of market share in the last 12 months. So that's the market signal that we're seeing right now. I think a lot of it's tied to affordability. We did some polling. We hired Ipsos to do a poll this summer. Number one reason British Columbians are reluctant to buy an electric vehicle is the cost. Averaged $8,000 to $10,000 more purchase price than a comparable non-electric vehicle. And then the other top two concerns is charging access and range anxiety. And it is ironic, although the range has been improving with electric vehicles, at the same time public concern about range has been going up. So even though range is getting better, public concern is getting stronger about that issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a real disparity between what goes on in the Lower Mainland and the GTA versus the rest of Canada. It is not a 17-minute average commute. It's not, when your job is in your truck to get from well site to well site or field to field, it's not 17 minutes, and that is a great issue. Could you, anything else you'd like to add? Open forum.
Just that, you know, I think if we look back to what's been working so far, electric vehicles took off without a government directive. Cell phones became popular without the government telling phone manufacturers you can't make landlines anymore. It was consumer demand. Improved technology sold itself without government subsidies and without mandates.
Thank you very much,
Mr.
Mr. Penner.
Penner. Thank you, Mr. Bexte.